Hello, hello, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to this fifth session of TNI's and Partners Fractures Internationalist Teaching Series, brought to you by TNI and collaborating partners, the Asia-Europe People's Forum, NOR, Alternative Information and Development Center, and the Global Network of Movement Lawyers. The world is changing. The world is looking different. A lot of people, there's a lot of information out there. And as TNI and partners, we thought it would be important to take time to cut through all the noise, to really ground our understanding of the current moment and understand what is going on from a progressive perspective. If you are like me, then you are definitely worried about the state of the world. We're hearing the drums of war everywhere. If you are like me living in Europe, the drums used to be far away, but they're now very close. They're in Ukraine. If you're in Sudan, if you're in the Congo, if you're in Palestine, the drums of war are happening right where you are. Are we headed to a third world war? Is this the scenario that we find ourselves right now? In the 80s, people had a doomsday clock counting down the seconds to when the next moment of global conflagration would begin. Do we need to have that clock again today? That's the main question of today's teach-in. We've got an amazing lineup of speakers who are going to give us a bit of an understanding of exactly what is going on with the state of the world today and with the state of peace and war. I would like to invite you to share any resources that are relevant to the conversation in the chat. Please have a conversation with all the other people that are in the room as well. If you have specific questions for our discussants, please put them in the Q&A section where they can be picked up to then be asked directly to them as part of the session. If you are having trouble following what participants are saying, please, there's a show captions button on Zoom that you can use that allows you to sort of also read what people are saying in real time. I'd also like to, of course, remind our speakers to not speak too fast and help so that everybody else kind of can follow what is going on. I'll be co-moderating today's session with a very prolific and very somebody who's been working with TNI for a long time, Anuradha Chenoy. She's an adjunct professor at the JNU University in India, and she works with the Europe People's Forum. We're very happy for you to join us today, Anu, and looking forward to an awesome session today that will break through all the noise and help us to really understand what's going on. But first, let's get a first understanding of how do people feel about the state of the world right now. I'd like to find out from you, what do you think is the likelihood that we're headed to a third world war? Just choose one of the options that are on the poll on the screen right now. How likely do you believe a third world war is within the next 10 years? Is it highly likely? Is it like we're really on the slippery slope towards there? Is it somewhat likely? Is it just how current crises evolve? Is it unlikely in the sense that the risks are being overstated and diplomacy will hold? Or is it very unlikely in the sense that despite all the flaws in the international system, no war is really going to happen? No world war is going to happen. So please just make your choice in the poll, excuse me, and we will see how the room feels, and this will also guide how our conversation evolves. Just a minute for you to do the poll, and after that, I will hand over to my co-moderator, Anu, who will introduce our speakers and kick us off for today's session. Anu, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sean, for setting the agenda. I mean, the terrible agenda that we have around us. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce three wonderful speakers that we'll have today. There's Samar Al-Bulushi. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at UC Irvine. Her book, War Making as World Making, Kenya and the United States, and the War on Terror, was published by Stanford University. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a contributing editor for Africa is a Country. And of course, she writes, she's a prolific writer. Then we have Andrew Feinstein. He is the executive director of Shadow World Investigations. He's a former African National Congress member of Parliament from South Africa. He's also the author of multiple books, including the critically acclaimed book called The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, which was shortlisted for the Alan Paton Prize. He is a co-editor of Monstrous Anger of the Guns. Andrew was actually named amongst the 100 most influential people in the world working on armed violence reduction by Action on Armed Violence. Welcome, Andrew. And then we have Niamh Ni Bhriain. Niamh coordinates TNI's War and Pacification program, which focuses on the permanent state of war. She holds an LLM in international human rights law from the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland. Before she joined TNI, Niamh spent a number of years living in Colombia and Mexico and working with civil society and working on peace and transitional justice. She also spent time in Brussels, and some of you might have seen on Instagram that currently she's busy trying to mobilize in Ireland on the issue of neutrality. So we'll start today's session. I'm going to ask Niamh a question, but of course she can, speak broadly. And I think my first question is, Niamh, what is the state of militarization today? What is driving it? Where is it headed? And do you think nuclear war is an actual possibility? Niamh, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Anu. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to Sean, Jess, and Nick, also my colleagues at TNI, and also to Andrew and Samar for sharing the panel with me. They're massive questions. And I think also even just the question of, are we headed towards World War III? And I see that somebody put in the chat there that we're already in a low-level state of world war. And I would have to agree. And I think that there's probably many people joining us on this webinar today that are living potentially living in war zones, living in areas of conflict. I'm joining from the safety of Ireland, which is a very safe country. There's an awful lot of fear mongering going on, warmongering, that Ireland should abandon its neutrality and join military alliances in somewhat a belief that will make us safer. And so I think in the second round of questions, I'll come to the question of neutrality as a tool to actually push back against the warmongering. But to the first question, and what is the state of militarization? I mean, maybe just to give some figures. So CIPRI, which is generally understood to be the authority on military spending, figures each year, produces the annual military spending report, and the most recent report, which came out a few weeks ago, cited a figure of $2.7 trillion is being spent globally on military equipment, militarization. This figure is unprecedented. It's been increasing now year on year for well over a decade. At the same time as we have this increase in militarization, in military spending, we also have escalating wars, we have escalating conflicts, regional civil war also. We have the normalization of genocide. I think it's really important to recognize, as we sit here from wherever we're joining from around the world, there are over 2 million people being starved to death in Palestine right now as we sit here. That's the reality. The fact that they're being starved to death is being imposed by a military occupation that is backed by the most powerful states in the world. And that situation is brought about because we have seen that, you know, militarization is about profit, it's about control, it's about dominance, it's about territorial expansion. And, you know, I sit in a country in Europe, and Europe is at the center of that. So is the United States, so are Western powers. And I suppose going to the question of what's driving it, I mean, I would say profit, greed, late stage capitalism. Just maybe to give the example of the European Union, which is probably the work that we do most in TNI and the War and Pacification program, we look at the militarization of the European Union. We have seen that in the last decade, but going back even further, we have arms company lobbyists and arms company representatives at the decision-making table in supposedly democratic spaces, and they are shaping the policies that are then rolled out by our governments, and they benefit to the tunes of millions. So when you say what's driving it, I think it's a mix of the profits that can be made from war. There's an awful lot of people getting rich. War is bad for most people, but for some people, they do very well from it. So I think there's a lot being driven by that. And then there's also a colonialist mindset, a colonialist logic, colonialist practice that we still see rolled out by the same colonialist powers that have been in you know, dominating world affairs for centuries. Maybe if we just take NATO, I think, as an example, you know, we're coming up to the NATO summit again this year, and it's going to be held in The Hague. I mean, NATO is a war alliance. It's controlled with, it's basically a tool of US empire, of US imperialism. Europe is deeply embedded in NATO, the European Union included. And, you know, it's concerned with expansion, with control. And if you look at the military spending of NATO, it's over 55% of global military spending is coming from NATO-aligned countries. That said, NATO continuously seeks to spend more and more money. So before, there was a kind of a baseline that NATO countries were expected to spend about 2% of their GDP on militarization. That has now been, you know, the request has gone in at 5% from Donald Trump. And that has been kind of flattened back down a bit by the Secretary General Rutte, back down to about 3.5, 3.7%. We had Mark Rutte appear in the European Parliament shortly after he was appointed as the NATO Secretary General, and he told the European Parliament that Europe spends, you know, a quarter of its income is being spent on healthcare, on social services, and on pensions, and that NATO needs a fraction of that money in order to continue rolling out its war machine. So there's no, you know, there's no kind of it's not that they're not going after that money. They're very clear. NATO is very clear. We have to give up some of our pensions, our healthcare, and our social services in order to continue funding this war machine, which, let us be very clear, it has not made any of us safer. It has not reduced. It has actually fueled conflict, war, genocide. It's making massive profits for the richest people in the world. And, you know, it's also, if we connect this in with climate, which we might get onto discussing later, this is really escalating the climate disaster that I'm sure all of us in different parts of the world that are joining today will have felt in some way, shape, or form. Like, I'm in Ireland, and we've had an unprecedented dry spell. We've never had so much dry weather in Ireland, not in my living memory. But, you know, all of this militarization is driving us towards escalating war, conflict, climate disaster, climate breakdown, and we're seeing a total normalization of that instead of, you know, a push for peace, for diplomacy. Where we're headed is, it's really this, it's almost this logic of the survival of the fittest. It's also driven very much by a white supremacist logic, this idea that us kind of, you know, this idea that white, Christian, West, that those are the people that must be salvaged, and kind of, you know, those and the rest kind of logic. And, you know, this kind of European, US kind of dominated way of thinking. it's coming alongside the total erosion of international law. I mean, since you know, the end of World War II, we've seen the rollout of, you know, international law. It's not perfect by any stretch, but we have seen that at least there's international law and there's governance mechanisms that states are, you know, supposed to live by. But we've seen total erosion of international law. I would prefer to live in a world where there is international law as opposed to what's now being called the rules-based international order. None of those rules are written down in the rule book. You know, you ask, where is this rule book we hear so much about? You know, there's no mention, whereas international law, the language is being totally eroded. Just one last thing, and then I'll finish on that. I mean, just to mention one document that came out from the European Union in the last few weeks was the 2030 Defence Readiness Plan. This is a war plan. You know, it's being rolled out by Europe. It's offering unprecedented money, 800 billion euros, 800 billion euros. I think it was about 5 billion euros that the European Union assigned for climate response. So we have 800 billion. That's basically going to be drawn down in loans. So we're going to get into this massive round of austerity to fund even more weapons. We're going to ramp up, you know, military mobilization so that we can get troops to war as soon as, you know, they're needed. And, you know, the only mention of peace is at the very end of this long document. We get at the very end, peace through strength. So it's this total distortion of what peace actually means. It's not, you know, about peace as in people living in a peaceful context, or that we would try to build peace through justice, through liberation. The idea is peace through strength. So the more militarized you are, the less likely you're going to be to be exposed to attack. When all of what we've seen for decades and history has shown us that the more you militarize, the more you ramp up, the more you have an arms race, the more likely you are to go to war. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, Sean and Anu, for now, and we'll hopefully come back to some more of those thoughts in the next round.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Niamh. And indeed, the moment you start seeing weapons being stockpiled, there seems to be a pushing logic that they're going to be used. They're going to be deployed somewhere. And you spoke right now about sort of the colonialist mindset that drives what we're seeing. And in the beginning, you mentioned in particular the profit motive that we're seeing. So there's a lot of money that's going into this military industrial complex. Andrew, who's our next speaker, has spent quite some time studying and writing about sort of this global arms industry. And maybe I'll take it to you, Andrew, about this, the motives behind all of this. Can you tell us more about the actors that are involved in the arms industry, and how do they profit and propel the militarism that we're seeing right now?
Sure. First of all, thanks very much to the organizers, to my fellow panelists, and to all of you who are participating in this conversation today. It's obviously a crucial conversation at a crucial time. So I study mainly the trade in weapons, which is the underpinning of the militarism that is so dominant in our world at the moment. And the arms trade is effectively a process of collusion between a number of high-level actors, the most important, or at least the most public of whom, are our politicians. And I would argue that in our current moment, we probably have the most mendacious, mediocre, and corrupt political leaders we have seen in the world, certainly in my lifetime, and I'm over 60 years old. A concept of extreme corruption called state capture is now prevalent in the world. This is the idea that the highest office of state, the departments of state, the policy-making process itself, is captured for narrow private interests. And I don't think it takes any particularly deep analysis around the world to observe this phenomenon in action. to the extent that I use the words of the American journalist Greg Palast to describe those countries that live under what is still thought of to be liberal democracy. We have the best democracies money can buy because our democracies are bought and paid for. Our politicians are often the puppets of, the spokespeople for, a tiny group of what I would describe as oligarchs, billionaires, corporate titans, who effectively control the direction of the world. And this is a world that is not just driven by this form of late neoliberal capitalism, what I refer to as the rip-off phase of neoliberal capitalism, where literally, living in a place like the United Kingdom where I do, where you now pay as much for water and electricity as you do in rental, even in a city like London where rents are sky high, it feels as though as you walk down the street, when you see your bills, you're being hit over the head and various corporations are just emptying your pockets. And the people with the baseball bat hitting you over the head are our politicians and our governments, who are becoming ever more authoritarian. So we are seeing, for instance, climate protesters, pro-Palestinian activists, journalists being arrested and charged under anti-terror legislation. And you ask the question, why? Well, how else do you sustain a system that is entirely focused on the betterment of a tiny, tiny minority at the expense of the vast majority? And it is only by intensified repression and authoritarianism. But what also dominates our politics and our economics, which are obviously totally intertwined, and Niamh made mention of this, is an extreme ethno-nationalism that is underpinned by a racist white supremacy. And what this leads to is the sort of out-of-control militarism that we have in the world at the moment. I want to take an aspect of what Niamh said about the profit motive and the economics of militarism a step further. The trade in weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in all world trade. This is a terrifying figure. And it becomes even more terrifying when we understand that an enormous amount of these corrupt monies find their way back into our political systems in both the buying and the selling countries. So when Britain sells billions of pounds worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, or to the United Arab Emirates, it is not only senior politicians, military leaders, and officials in those countries who are benefiting from this corruption. Some of this corruption feeds back to the selling country. And money finds its way into our major political parties and into the hands of our most senior politicians. So to give you just one quick example, we estimate very conservatively that Tony Blair, since leaving office, and let's remember that Margaret Thatcher described Tony Blair as her greatest political achievement because it effectively turned the opposition Labour Party into a warmongering neoliberal party, no different to the Conservative Party, to use Britain as an example. Tony Blair, we estimate conservatively, has made, since leaving office, directly out of the decision to invade Iraq and his association with BAE Systems and other major arms companies, over £110 million personally. So when people come into office, they know if they make the right decisions, this is the reward at the end of their period in office. So it feeds and finances our politics and our politicians. So as Niamh said, war is big business, and it is profitable for those who have their hands on the levers of power. And it's for this reason that the countries of the so-called West, what I like to call the global minority, favor conflict over peace every time. And the one fact that brings this home to me is the reality that the United States of American government employs more people to run one aircraft carrier than it has diplomats across the entire world. And today, the United States of America has 12 aircraft carriers. Now, I want to briefly deal with another dimension of this, because I agree, I think we are in an incredibly dangerous position. The claim is made by our politicians and our corporate titans that this massive increase in defense spending in the United Kingdom, we are seeing an increase in defense spending that from 2027 will go up to an increase of £15.4 billion a year, at the same time that £7 billion is being taken away from the NHS, our health service, and over £4.5 billion taken away from basic welfare benefits for people living with disabilities and other issues that require state support. And we are told that this is actually good for our economies. Now, this is a nonsense. There are myriad studies, and I'm going to put a link to a book that you can access for free in the chat called Indefensible: 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade. In fact, increased defense spending acts as a drag on economic growth and prosperity, and as importantly, increases in defense spending do not make us safer. In fact, in many countries, the opposite has been observed, that they make us less safe for reasons that I can go into. So effectively, if we continue to allow this militarism to dominate our world in the way that it does, it is not only the indescribable human suffering that we've all been seeing on our screens from Congo, from Sudan, from Yemen, and of course from Gaza that is going to continue. But the global arms trade will continue to make our societies and our world less democratic, more corrupt, and much less safe. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that wonderful and very brief argument, which really connects the politics, the economics, and the social impact of war and militarism and militarization, Andrew. And now we have Samar. Samar, my question to you would be, how is war making world making, like Andrew and Niamh just showed? And how does it intersect with US imperialism? And how does US militarism, for example, shape the global South? Samar?
Thank you, Anu, and thank you to all of the organizers at TNI. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I think perhaps just before I answer those series of questions, I just want to begin by acknowledging a comment or question that was posed in the chat a few minutes ago, which I believe the person who raised it was Serwa Asante. And they were saying that perhaps we need to redefine and revisit what we mean by world war. And I take that as a very important provocation, given the tendency to focus on great power conflict, and then relatedly, the tendency to focus on the experiences of people in the global North, who Andrew rightly referred to as the global minority. And I think there is still a tendency to overlook ongoing forms of violence, which are made possible by global forces that many people across the global South experience on a daily basis as a form of war. So perhaps this is something we can revisit during the discussion. What I want to do today is to think about how the post 9/11 quote unquote war on terror and the ways in which the US government has, ever since the launch of this war in 2001, sought to remake the world through war. And by this, I have in mind a couple of things. First, I'm thinking about the laws, the policies, and the violent practices that are used to pacify and contain racialized populations. Second, I have in mind the political economy of militarism, which we've heard a lot about so far from our panelists. And third, I have in mind the discursive battles at the level of ideas. So here I'm thinking about what constitutes legitimate and illegitimate violence, and even about what constitutes war itself. I think we saw with the beginning of the Obama administration, a growing invocation of, well, one, a shift away from the explicit language of war, right? They were very careful to no longer refer to what they were doing as a war on terror. And we started to see growing invocations of law and legality, as well as a rhetoric of non-war. So employing terms that would distract us from the fact that what they are doing is war. So one example of that would be a term like stabilization, right? Which completely distracts us from the fact that we're talking about destruction and violence. Another term that we've seen is areas of active hostilities, which is a deliberate term used by the US government to avoid needing to obtain congressional approval for war. So what we've seen is that the US has actively sought to redefine the meaning of war and to rationalize its ability to conduct war in countries that it's not technically at war with. It has employed a dizzying array of laws and procedures that are ostensibly designed to safeguard civilians in contexts of war. And this is especially the case with regards to drone violence. And so we're led to believe, they want us to believe, right, that the US cares about civilians and that it goes to great lengths to protect civilians in contexts of war. But the effect of this has been to channel much of the critique, particularly in relation to the war on terror, to minuscule debates about questions of law and legality. And we see this particularly with large human rights groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, such that their focus is on how to wage war more humanely, right? And so what we lose sight of then is the much bigger and much more important question of the decision to wage war itself. Now, of course, the war on terror is a major driving force of war making today, but it's important to recognize the ways in which security orientations permeate, the realms of democracy, of development assistance, of humanitarianism, et cetera, all of which have had the effect of displacing critique of militarism and militarization. So we have a much broader geopolitical landscape that has embraced military solutions to political problems. And I raise this because I think it's important to recognize that the US is not alone, even though it is the driver, right, of militarism today, and to acknowledge the ways in which multilateral organizations like the UN are also complicit, because this has implications for the kinds of activism that is required, I think, to push back. As far as how US militarism is shaping the global South, here we can think about the rise of the US Military Command for Africa, otherwise known as AFRICOM, which was set up during the Bush administration, but then became fully operational under Obama. And as of last year, AFRICOM has 29 known military facilities across 15 countries in the continent. But it's important here to think about the ways in which US power extends far beyond military bases. In Africa, the US has worked steadily to transform foreign security forces, African security forces, into extensions of its own power. And I think perhaps we can think about the context in which this is occurring. There's been a shift in tactics employed by the US, partly prompted by war fatigue and the failures of its military occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so this led to a shift away from full-scale invasions to more targeted operations in the form of drones. and a growing reliance on the security forces of Global South states. And so this dispersal of power has several effects. It makes the US role less visible and thereby less traceable, right? Which then has important implications for accountability efforts. So in Somalia, for example, it's not US troops that are doing the bulk of the fighting. Somalia has been the site, as many of you know, of an undeclared war for over 15 years. And there you've seen the US training both Somali forces and training a range of African forces who have been deployed to the country in what has been referred to as a quote unquote peacekeeping operation. Again, we need to pay attention to language and the ways in which it distracts us. And that peacekeeping operation at its height was composed of 22,000 African peacekeepers. So again, it's Africans who are engaging in the labor of violent warfare. This is something that's overlooked. And as a result, we lose sight of US complicity. In Kenya, we see the same. The US has been training special police forces that are engaged in disappearances and extrajudicial killings. So this serves as a reminder of the more conventional forms of state violence that are sustaining the war on terror. And in effect, the US has been providing the license for Global South states more broadly to expand their policing, their military forces, and their surveillance capabilities, and to crack down on dissent, all in the name of quote unquote security. So I think the point I just want to end with is that what we see is that there's no longer a clear beginning or end to war, because even the geography of war zones has become more blurred. It's become more temporally open-ended. It's become more spatially dispersed. So war is no longer an exceptional event characterized by spectacular forms of violence. Instead, it's really a protracted assault, right, on the dignity and safety of people across the world. And the last point I'll make, I've just remembered, is that I think we equally need to pay attention to the role of Global South states in the politics of militarized interventionism. And we can take the decision by Kenya to lead a multinational police operation in Haiti as an example of this. Now, there is a tendency to focus or to describe Kenya in these contexts merely as a proxy of the United States. And of course, there are power dynamics at play, there are political economic interests that are driving Kenya to take on this role. But we should not overlook the possibility that Kenya, much like Brazil before it, is seeing Haiti as an opportunity to experiment with new forms of counterinsurgent warfare that it will then deploy on its populations back home. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Samar. And thank you to all our speakers for this amazing first round of questions and answers. Quite a lot has come out from this. I mean, from the economic elements, somebody posted already in the chat that warfare is a standard of capitalism. It's a feature, not a bug in capitalism. While leaders may have their own motives, as Andrew pointed out, of course, there's also the global capitalist system that pushes this. Many questions also in the chat about what actually counts as a world war, right? Because someone said the First World War and the Second World War were European tribal wars with global impact and not necessarily world wars. So what defines a war? How do we actually conceptualize what we mean when we're talking about war, especially when it's not tanks invading, but two drones going out in the middle of the night? So interesting questions that we're seeing also with the audience, with the people in the chat, reflecting on the conversations. There's just too much to cover in the time we have, but I'm just bringing this up, hoping that it infuses into also the second round of conversation. And someone also pointed out that cyber warfare is also now something to consider. So just putting this to our speakers to say in the second round of questions, if we can also think about that. We wanted to first analyze the state of war, where we are, and then now to think about what do we do, right? How do we engage with this current situation that our three speakers have so eloquently described and given us so many insights into? If you have questions for the speakers, by the way, please put them in the Q&A, because it's very difficult to skim through everything that's going on in the chat. If it's a specific question, also if it's a question specifically to one of the speakers, please put that in the question in the Q&A. But we want to go now further to the second round of questions, thinking of what can we do about all of this. Niamh, you gave us a very wide-ranging kind of explanation of what's going on, also the difference between what's happening in the global north and how it's affecting the global south. From all these spaces, where are we seeing opposing forces and actors against this widespread militarism? Which all the new alliances are we witnessing? And from your perspective, where you stand, what hope is there for a global peace movement? And is that something we should work for? Lots of questions, I know, but I give the mic to you.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Again, yeah, lots of questions. I mean, I think it depends on where everyone is at in their particular context. And I think that we will all be starting out from a particular place that's probably different to the others on this call from wherever they're joining. So maybe just in terms of what we can do, because we've kind of already set out that, you know, we have an unprecedented level of militarization, we have wars, conflicts, famine, starvation, genocide, you know, happening in various locations around the world. We set out kind of the profits that are, you know, flowing from that and driving it. And it's very easy to feel disempowered, and that, you know, we're up against something absolutely massive and that's much bigger than us. And how can we tackle that? And I suppose, I mean, I can only really speak to my own experience in Ireland over the past few weeks. So Anu mentioned that I'm in Ireland on what we're calling a neutrality roadshow. So I've basically been going around Ireland for the last 3 weeks in a white transit van. And we've done, that's why I'm really quite tired, but we've spoken to hundreds of people in various locations around the country, and we've really just rallied wherever we can, in whatever manner that we can, local media, local newspaper, putting out a call that we really need to reassert and reestablish and reaffirm Irish neutrality. And in Ireland, Irish neutrality is very much something that is founded in a belief that it's an anti-imperialist stance, that we will not participate in imperialist wars. Irish neutrality comes from when the whole island of Ireland was under occupation by the British Empire. And at the beginning of World War I, there was a call that Irish people would go and fight in World War I. And so that's really from where our neutrality stems from, was when Irish people said, well, we're not going to be involved in imperialist foreign wars. We're not going to fight. We're going to remain neutral. And there was an expression which was neither king nor Kaiser, but Ireland. And this idea that we would not be going to serve in foreign wars. And that is something that, you know, it has stayed very much with us as Irish people, that we won't be going to fight in foreign wars, and that we will assert our neutrality, and that by doing so, that will have an active knock-on effect on other countries. So as one example, Shannon Airport, which is in the west of Ireland, is used almost every day by the US military as it, you know, arms Israel committing its genocide, as it bombs Yemen, as it, you know, moves massive amounts of weaponry out around the world to expand on the US imperialist project. Shannon Airport in Ireland is being used for that purpose. If the Irish government were to actually implement an active neutral policy, we would not be allowing the US to use our airport. Why is that important? It's important because neutrality makes warmongers very uncomfortable, because it shows that there is another way, that there is a possibility to oppose war and to promote peace by taking active steps. So, for example, it's very uncomfortable for the European Union if you were to have a country like Ireland that was actually saying, well, no, we don't want the US military using our country while it's perpetrating war and genocide. We're going to keep US forces out of Ireland. That would show Europe that actually it is possible to set out, you know, concrete steps for peace. And so I suppose, you know, the actions that you can take from wherever you're at in your particular place or area what we've decided to do is really connect in with local groups and urging them to take action, you know, to push for peace, to push for you know, an end to the normalization of the kinds of unprecedented levels of violence that we've seen over the past number of months and years. And maybe just to take there was a question, and I think it's really important, the question of, you know, what defines a world war, and I think it's really important that we actually look into that, because while we're here debating what defines a world war and whether we're already in one or not, or when it's coming, we maybe lose sight of the fact that, as I said at the beginning, there are vast areas and countries, regions in the world that have been experiencing war and militarization for decades. And, you know, I lived in Latin America for a number of years. There's huge levels of militarization. Mexico, for example, is one of the most militarized countries in the world. And that's rarely ever discussed as in the, you know, when you're framing war, you rarely ever think, oh, Mexico is a country that's at war. But the levels of violence in Mexico are off the charts in terms of, you know, massacres, forced disappearance. So I think, you know, it's really important if we don't just kind of get bogged down in, are we headed towards World War III, yes or no? And if we decide that we're not, then everything is fine and happy and we can all go home. But that actually we really dig into the you know, the different levels of violence that we've been seeing. Violence against people who are migrating, for example, the war on migrants that's been going on for decades. You know, we've been seeing people that are being you know, allowed to drown in the Mediterranean as a result of European Union militarization policies for decades. So yeah, just to maybe take the comment that was in the chat, I think it was a really pertinent comment, and I thank whoever I can't see the name right now, but thanks to the person who put that in there.
Yeah, thanks, Niamh, because like the Global South had till the 80s and the non-aligned movement, keeping out of Cold War politics, and it was a progressive movement. It was, you know, for supporting decolonization, against militarization, and of course now it's just moved into neutrality. So Andrew, my question to you now is, how do you think that movements can actually trip up the arms industry? What are the routes towards demilitarization?
Thanks very much for the question. So I think that we do have, and I feel almost terrible even saying this, but the widespread revulsion at what is happening in Gaza, at the world's first live screen genocide, where we are seeing a population effectively being starved to death, creates an important moment for the peace movement globally. One, because our politicians have never seemed as out of touch with the views and sentiments of the vast majority of people in their countries. And I think what is very important here is for those of us who do this work, and I know many of us on this call do, what is really important is to take what seem like conflicts far away and make them relevant to people's daily experience. Be that the roots of the conflict in Congo, that is so linked to many aspects of our daily lives in the global minority. Be that this massive increase in defense spending at the expense of all sorts of social spending. Because what our governments effectively offer us is permanent austerity and forever wars. And they can't be spending the billions on these forever wars without the permanent austerity. And I would add to that a third factor, which I mentioned earlier, which is the greater repression and authoritarianism around our own democracies and our own civil rights in the global minority countries. And of course, in many countries of the global majority, as Samar has pointed out, in many respects, their role in militarism. I think when we look to how do we trip them up, as you put it, the one thing we've got to remember is that if one analyzes what we have referred to historically, and I know that Sean referred to this earlier, the military-industrial complex, which I think is still a very useful term, except it's just become bigger and broader than ever before, because the tech companies are all effectively defense companies now. If you look at the percentage of their profits that come from the defense sector, it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and more important. But those that fund all of these entities, be it the defense companies, be it the tech companies, be it all those other companies, someone in the chat referred to those companies who profit from the consequences of war, stopping people coming into the countries of the global minority from the conflicts that we are profiting from in the global minority countries. And it's the financial institutions. And these financial institutions are the same institutions that house our pension funds, that are invested in the media, that is presenting us with an extraordinarily skewed perspective of the world in which we live, and are trying to convince us that this conflict and all of these wars are actually incredibly good for us. And there are not that many of them at this huge global scale, the Fidelities, the BlackRocks, et cetera, et cetera. There's sort of half a dozen of them that are actually crucial. And I think we need to look to be targeting these in a variety of different ways. Then finally, a couple of other quick points. The obvious point, information is power. We have got to be talking to as many people as possible in as many ways as possible about what is really going on in the world, because our media is no longer performing that function. We need to be shifting people's thinking. And then I think we should remind ourselves that protest, while it seems as though, over 1 million people turned out in opposition to the Iraq war, hundreds of thousands turn out on the streets of London, for instance, every few weeks in opposition to what is happening in Gaza. This sort of symbolic and very observable protest remains incredibly important to keep the pressure on our politicians. But also, I want to mention the role of direct action. In the United Kingdom, we have a group called Palestine Action, who focus on one of Israel's key defense companies, Elbit Systems, who are, together with IAI, probably the two companies in Israel most complicit in the genocide. Palestine Action have managed to close down 3 of Elbit's 10 factories in the United Kingdom, and they have cost Elbit a contract with Britain's Ministry of Defence worth over £280 million. We have seen a lot of providers to Elbit of various services withdraw from their relationships with Elbit as a consequence of that direct action campaign. So while I know direct action is not something we can all engage in, it is something we should keep very much in mind when developing our strategies that are appropriate for our own contexts and our own localities around the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Andrew. And yeah, indeed, there are multiple avenues for us to get involved, for movements to come together and push back. And I think the particular issue of Gaza, what we're seeing in Gaza right now and what we're seeing in the Congo and in Sudan, have really galvanized a new generation and really brought out also all the older folks who are in the peace movement to say we need to do something to change what's going on. And these strategies that you just shared and some of these tactics will be useful in making that happen. Samar has been working on the concept of non-alignment. And this already kind of came up, I think, a version of it. Niamh spoke about neutrality in Ireland. And you spoke, Andrew, of internal actions that push the perspectives of politicians and actually symbolically also stand up and say something has to change. Samar, is non-alignment an effective strategy? Perhaps maybe what exactly do we mean by non-alignment, and is it effective? What would that look like today, and what alternatives are there if it's not the way to go?
Great. So I think we've seen in the past couple of years an opening for a new politics of non-alignment that has resonances with its historic forms in the form of Bandung and the non-aligned movement itself. And part of this has been prompted, I would say, by two things. First, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, after which we saw this very dramatic debate unfold at the United Nations and the General Assembly, when a large number of global South states refused to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. A good number of those who refused to condemn and or abstained were African states. And I think so what we started to see was a growing sense of clarity, right, about not wanting to take sides in this war. Of course, the second impetus has been the genocide in Gaza. So what I think is important to acknowledge here, as far as the limitations of this new politics of non-alignment, is that it is driven primarily by the national interests of individual nation states in a way that is, I think, different from what we saw of the politics of the 50s and 60s, which was driven by, I would argue, more of a shared political vision that was focused on realizing a more equitable international order. So here I just want to flag the potential for rhetoric to sway us in a way that we might overlook the substance of the statements that are made by global South states. And I also think it's important here to distinguish between multilateralism, which is a term that we use, that we see invoked more and more in recent years, particularly by global South states who are calling for a more equitable global order. But we need to be thinking critically about what multilateralism means and whether it, in fact, represents merely a way to make sense of shifts in the geopolitical landscape rather than something to aspire towards in and of itself, right? Because I think multilateralism, again, continues to be driven by the national interests of states, whereas internationalism, right, particularly the internationalism of the 50s and 60s, again, I would argue was really motivated by a sense of people-to-people solidarity as much as it was global South states asserting their position on the global stage. So here, I think there's still a risk that nationalism and national interests will continue to drive and constrain the possibilities for international solidarity. And to Andrew's point, a few minutes ago, it's really been the people taking to the streets, right, rather than government officials to condemn the genocide in Gaza, right? So I think we need to be looking to people forms of solidarity rather than states as our source of hope and inspiration. And perhaps I can just speak a bit more broadly about kind of strategies going ahead. I think first it's important to think about how we conceive of the scope of the problem that we're trying to confront, and to ask ourselves whether we're making demands on existing structures or if we're hoping to look beyond those existing structures, and to recognize the limitations of each, right? Including the possibility that making demands of existing structures could do more to legitimize those structures rather than to genuinely transform or abolish them. So here we might think about the UN Security Council and the fact that global South states have been calling for a greater participation, a permanent membership at the Security Council. We can also think about the G20 and the fact that South Africa has now been included alongside the African Union. And those, some might argue are important steps in terms of representation, right, in those important venues. But, well, one, we have to think about, the potential for competition between global South states to obtain those seats, right? Because inevitably, I think that's going to come to the fore. But two, what beyond the symbolism of representation can we expect? Precisely given that these states are far more likely to be protecting their interests than necessarily standing up for the needs of the people, right? So then the next point that I want to make is that we need to be thinking about the context in which these calls for multilateralism are occurring, and more broadly, the context in which global South states are becoming more assertive on the global stage, including through invocations of non-alignment. And this is where it starts to get tricky in terms of making sense of the potential decline of US imperial power, what states are rising to the fore, what language do we have available to us to make sense of the power wielded by those states? Will we continue to use the language of imperialism? Are we going to be using other terms? Some have proposed the language of multipolar imperialism, given that power is likely to be more dispersed. What does that then mean for the activism that we want to pursue? And I want to offer a very concrete example in the form of the military coups that took place in the Sahel in the last couple of years. We saw a celebration by Western activists of those military coups, largely on the grounds that they represented the declining influence of France and the United States in the region. These governments were forced to withdraw their troops from many of these states in the Sahel. And I just want to urge some caution here about, celebrating too early, partly because, one, we've learned that the US continues to share intelligence with some of these countries in the Sahel. So the US is not entirely removed from the scene. Two, what has emerged now is a sub-regional body known as the Alliance of Sahel States, and they are working with other outside powers, right, who continue to promote militaristic approaches to the problem. Even the Sahelian governments are continuing to use the language of terrorism to justify, and to the point that Niamh made earlier about CIPRI's statistics in military spending, we've seen a major spike in military spending in the Sahelian states in particular, just in the last year. So that's something we need to wrestle with. And finally, it remains unclear what impact these changes have had, despite this grand rhetoric of anti-imperialism, on the day-to-day lives of people on the ground. So I think what's really important here, as we are inclined to be seduced by the language of anti-imperialism in these contexts, that we need to be thinking critically about substantive versus symbolic forms of change. I'll leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Samar. And thank you so much to all our speakers who've really kind of brought in multiple perspectives on this, and for the bubbling chat that I can see a lot of people raising questions and bringing in their own insights. Please, if you have other questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A. But for now, maybe I go back to you, Niamh. In your first contribution, you spoke about sort of the climate element. That doesn't seem to be necessarily always linked to what we're seeing with militarism, since militarism is in its corner, and then a lot of the other movements are kind of also in their own space. But I think we've seen a sort of convergence of people understanding that these issues are not necessarily separate, and that maybe an anti-militarism movement might also be the climate movement might be part of that. And also maybe other different movements that we're seeing globally. Would you perhaps share your insights on that, and perhaps also just really link it to the need for systemic change that we need to see if we're going to not have a state of permanent war?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I just on the climate stuff, I mean, I think it's very clear that the planet as a whole is at risk because of human activity, advanced capitalism, in terms of the really, exacerbating climate crisis that we're seeing and that we have been seeing for the last number of years. I don't think anyone can deny that, like I said at the beginning, we've had one of the warmest and driest months in Ireland ever on record, and those records continue to be broken every year. And you know, often missed in that piece is that militarization is central to actually driving this climate crisis. So you have, on the one hand, the direct emissions that come from military equipment. Even if you just look at the emissions coming from the hundreds of US military bases that are dotted around the world, you know, massive military emissions. The types of fuel that are used in fighter jets, for example, you know, you have all of those kinds of military emissions coming from the military apparatus or military equipment in and of itself that are directly impacting the climate. But then you also have the militarization that is rolled out to protect, for example, fossil fuel companies. So, you know, it's very rare that you would have a fossil fuel company that isn't backed up and protected by a military structure. So I remember when I lived in Colombia, for example, there were specific battalions of the Colombian army that were tasked with providing protection to gas and oil pipelines that were flowing through Colombia. In most parts of the world, you have, you know, resource for example, in Mozambique, you have the French company Total that's, you know, trying to access fossil fuels from Mozambique, and that's being protected by military structures. So you have the direct emissions that are rolled out from fighter jets and that kind of thing, and their impact on the environment. And then you have the indirect impact of having the militarization of security for fossil fuel companies. And then you also have the militarized response that is rolled out whenever you have activists that challenge, for example, fossil fuel companies. You will have a militarized policing or militarized security army response. And so it's, you know, if you're going to try and stop the climate crisis, you really have to get you really have to become familiar with just how central militarization is in all of that. What we've seen the arms companies do is that they have cleverly actually manufactured their way or manipulated their way into a role where now they actually frame themselves as being the solution to the climate crisis. So they've said, well, actually, we can just make greener weapons, or we can, you know, have solar panels on our military bases instead of using oil and gas. So, you know, they've been very clever. They've seen that it's a good opportunity to frame militarization as something that's actually a solution to climate crisis instead of part of, you know, one of the central components of the problem. We had the European Union a few years ago rolling out workshops on how the military is going green, and that this was something that we should celebrate instead of questioning, because somebody put in the chat there, the kind of the system as a whole, that the fact that the military exists at all in the way, shape and form that it does is actually central to driving the climate crisis. So yeah, I think anyone who's active on climate really needs to look at their role also in being active and in anti-war movements, because it's impossible to delve into the fundamental kind of crisis in climate if you're not looking also at what's happening with war.
There are some questions for Andrew. I think one is from Katerina, and she's saying that direct actions and protests are essential, but we also need strikes and resignations. So basically, she's asking that how do you understand this resurgence of military Keynesianism, and how do we effectively challenge it from a workers' and justice-oriented perspective? And a similar question which says, why aren't protests stopping governments? And do any of the speakers think that the military-industrial complex is negotiable? So if Andrew can address these three. Andrew?
Sure. First of all, on the issue of strikes and resignations, this is a really important point, because what should be happening is we should see we've seen a few isolated incidents of dock workers refusing to load weapons onto ships, for instance. We've seen some ensure that ships can't land at certain ports. But there is a disjuncture here in that there have been times in the past where workers in munitions or related factories have simply refused to work on weaponry or components that are going to certain types of regimes or conflicts. And I think back, obviously, to the Pinochet regime in Chile, where there were workers in factories in the United Kingdom who refused to work on jets that were being made for Pinochet's regime. And ultimately, some of those jets weren't delivered. In the United Kingdom, the head of the biggest union, the general secretary of the biggest union, Unite, actually said in a statement a couple of months ago that the jobs of her members was more important than what was happening in any conflict outside of the UK, which was a truly astonishing thing to say. And there is a lot of disquiet amongst union members at the moment with their leadership stance on the British government's role and the defense company's role in Gaza and in a number of conflicts around the world. And this is something I think that we need to try and intensify, is action within trade unions to encourage workers to organize themselves to refuse to work on certain types of munitions or components or spare parts. In terms of the sort of the reemergence of military Keynesianism, if you will, I think speaks, if anything, to the economic crisis in the global minority countries, where we have seen where there are levels of growth, they are anemic. They're being driven primarily by credit rather than by any meaningful productive activity. And I think that this reemergence of military Keynesianism sees the sort of ultra-militarism that we've been talking about for the last hour or so combine with a sort of an economic crisis of late neoliberal capitalism. The reality is there is no evidence to suggest that military Keynesianism has worked anywhere outside of the United States of America during the Second World War. Other than that, and I recommend to you the book that I posted that you can access called Indefensible, where there are a lot of the economic studies that have been done on this. We experienced in South Africa, after the government of which I was a part decided to do a huge arms deal for weapons that we had absolutely no need of, simply for the corruption involved in that deal. And we actually saw that that arms deal, which our finance and trade and industry ministers told us was going to have a hugely positive impact on our economy, was going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs, had exactly the opposite impact. It's actually argued that it might have reduced our growth every year that we were paying off for that deal. It didn't produce one meaningful, sustainable job. So I think that but the reemergence doesn't surprise me given the confluence of these political and economic factors. Why are these protests not stopping our governments? Because our governments have become completely dislocated from the people they're supposed to serve. I mean, let's think for a moment, and I'm sorry to talk so much about the global minority countries, but let's think for a moment of Germany, a country that, in my opinion, is in a state of national psychosis when it comes to Gaza and its complicity in the genocide. We have the country that was responsible for the Holocaust, of which my mother was a survivor and lost dozens of her family, actually seeing its police forces beat up Jews, sometimes wearing kippahs, wearing yarmulkes, for their opposition to the genocide being committed by Israel. Now, any basic logic would suggest that this is not what a country like Germany should be doing. Also, given that Germany has been involved in two other Holocausts, in what is today Namibia and in Armenia. So this notion that it can somehow atone for the Holocaust by being uncritical in its support of Israel speaks to this completely incorrect notion that Israel represents all Jews, or that all Jews are supportive of Israel and what it is doing in the occupied territories, which is a weird form of racism, in my own opinion. But what this speaks to is just how out of touch our governments are with the vast majority of our population. So how do we make this count if protest isn't working? Forms of direct action become really important. Forms of tax boycott are things that we've got to start considering. You know, there are veterans in the United States of America who withhold 30% of their tax returns. They claim that is what they refer to as the Lockheed tax. 30 cents in every dollar that goes to the tax authorities lands up in the hands of the defense contractors in America. And they don't want to have anything to do with that. And the authorities don't know how to deal with it, so they just ignore it. I think we have to start looking at these mechanisms. And then another thing that I think is starting to happen in some countries of the global minority is that, well, in Britain in our last general election, we saw the lowest voter turnout since universal suffrage was introduced in the UK. And that shows a level of disaffection with politics that is almost unprecedented. And I think what we as activists and communities need to do is, where decent candidates don't exist, start putting up our own candidates to take on the established politicians and political parties, and to start grasping some of state power in order to fundamentally and profoundly transform the structures and the functioning of that state power.
Thank you so much, Andrew. The whole point of this series is really to understand what we see as fundamental changes or fractures in the global system, and also to frame those fractures also as possibilities, to look at where the light might be coming in for movements to exploit, for progressive forces to tilt the scale a little bit. So in the few minutes that we have left, I'd like to hear from the different speakers where you see fractures coming in. Samar, maybe we'll start with you. Where do you see fractures in the global system, and where is the light coming in from where you're standing? You spoke a lot about the global system and sort of some of these shifts in power and the increased agency of countries in the global south. Does that offer some possibilities? Or if not, where do you see the light coming in for us to tilt the scale away from this increasing militarism?
Yeah, so I think I would say that there is some room for hope in the growing assertiveness of global South states. And here I would take the example of South Africa taking Israel to the ICJ on the crime of genocide. I think that was immensely, immensely symbolic and important for not only for Palestinians, but people across the world as a form of international solidarity. So I think there is room, but I would again discourage us from placing all of our hopes on states, because as we know, they are never the ones to lead the way when it comes to change. And I think I would identify the kind of international solidarity that we've seen coalesce around Gaza, Sudan, and the Congo in last year and a half or so, since the onset of the genocide. And what makes this unique is that I think one of the challenges that we have faced when it comes to mobilizing people around contexts like the Sudan is that there is no one clearly defined boogeyman or enemy, for lack of a better word, right? And so here, again, I'm thinking about U.S. empire as a important mobilizing force to stand up against, right? And in the case of Sudan, we see instead the role primarily of the UAE, which one would argue is being enabled and facilitated by the United States, but it is slightly more complex scenario that then makes organizing more challenging. And yet, I think people are now starting to see the importance of thinking in more complex ways about the powers, the kinds of powers that we are up against. And here I would use the language of dispersal, right? That we need to disperse our analysis, to really more fully account for the kinds of actors that are at play. And therefore, we need to disperse our activism accordingly, right? So that means not placing all of our eggs in one basket in the form of sites like the International Court of Justice or the ICC. It means thinking about people-to-people forms of solidarity, mutual aid, as we've seen. And again, Sudan, I would say, is such a source of inspiration on that note, right? The kinds of mutual aid and neighborhood resistance committees that I think people can learn from all over the world. And finally, I would really, I think we have a lot to learn from feminists who have discouraged us from, when it comes to the question of militarism in particular. They're the ones, and I can take Amina Mama, the Nigerian feminist, as one example here, who really insist that militarism extends beyond the barracks, right? It extends into the fabric of people's daily lives. And if we draw in the thinking of people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis in thinking about questions of abolition, they too are saying that we need to expand our vision beyond, as in the US context, which is so often focused on the prison, to think about interlocked and interweaving forms and sources of oppression. So this means thinking about the connection between racism, patriarchy, militarism, policing, and war, for example. And that, I think, has, again, as I was saying, all kinds of implications for the kinds of strategies that we need to be developing. So again, if we rewind back to one of the framing questions, what does it mean, or is it even possible to dismantle this thing that we're calling the military-industrial complex? We have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by the military-industrial complex? And what would it mean to think about the forms of power that are, seemingly at the outskirts and that would remain in place even if this military-industrial complex were to be abolished, right? And I think of that, especially in the case of the African context, where people call for abolishing AFRICOM, for abolishing the African Military Command. Great, let's just say, and Donald Trump is saying, he is indicating that there may be some drawing down of AFRICOM for his own reasons. Let's just say that happens, right? We then still have to wrestle with the forms of power that will remain in place, namely the policing, all the policing bodies that have been invested with new powers across the continent. The final point I'll make is, again, at the level of ideas, because it is not sufficient to dismantle these infrastructures, right? These material infrastructures. We also have to think about the ways in which, and here again, I'll point to the global majority populations have been mobilized. Kenya is a perfect example of this, to support war. They have been socialized to think about their leaders as, to associate good leadership and strong leadership with a readiness to go to war, right? With a readiness to fight. And so we also have to think at that level, and perhaps in this moment where we're seeing attacks on universities and on the very notion of discussion and debate, it's all the more important that we need to focus on the realm of ideas.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Niamh, quickly follow up on that. Where are the fractures, and where do you see the light coming in?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just picking up on a few things that have been said, and maybe just from going around Ireland the last few weeks and speaking to people, and hundreds of people about how they're feeling on this global moment. It's never been clearer, I think, that there is a massive gap between the sentiment of the people and the action or inaction of the Irish government, in terms of how it's playing, how it's responded to Palestine as one example. But yeah, I think that is something that's replicated around the world. There's a massive gap between the people and the political representatives that are in power in their different countries. And I think it's never been clearer also that there's something fundamentally wrong. You know, you cannot get a house it's really difficult to access housing. Healthcare is in crisis, education is in crisis, social care. You know, very basic fundamental needs are being totally abandoned, you know, in many countries around the world. It has never been so clear, I think, that there's something fundamentally wrong when you can spend 2.7 trillion US dollars on creating, you know, an apparatus for death, for destruction, for devastation, but you cannot get a home. You cannot get, you know, access to a hospital. And I suppose it's what do you do with that knowledge, and how do you use it? And that awareness. And I mean, Andrew mentioned direct action, and I fully agree. In Ireland over the last few weeks, we've had, you know, really brave activists that have gone to the runway at Shannon Airport, gone out and tried to, you know, directly damage US warplanes that are flying through our airport. That kind of action, you know, not everybody will feel compelled to take that particular type of action, but many people are actually taking more direct action. We've had the same in Ireland with Mothers Against Genocide that have taken a lot of direct action around the country. So I suppose the knowledge that comes with this particular global moment, and then the direct actions that people take, is possibly where I see, you know, light coming in, I suppose.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Niamh. And Andrew, in a minute, where's the light coming in? What are the fractures we can
so very quickly, I
use?
think to take and emphasize Samar's point, we can't rely on states. We can't rely on corporations, fairly obviously. What we can rely on is people. And I think that what we are seeing, because the world is in such a moment of madness and has been for a few years now, I think more and more people are starting to realize that the system is broken and that we need something different. And I think what all of our role as activists is by purveying information, by giving people tangible things to get involved in at a local community level, but also at a more macro level of taking on the political and economic establishment. We are at a moment that could lead to a profound and systemic change in the nature, structure, and functioning of our politics and economics going forward. And that, to me, is a very important source of light in a moment of extraordinary darkness.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our speakers, Niamh, to Andrew, to Samar. Thank you so much to the TNI team in the background, Jess, Twyla, Nick. Thank you so much to my co-host, co-moderator, Anu. And thank you to everyone who has taken time out from their day to come and join us in this conversation. These are big issues. There doesn't seem to be any answer, but I think the first beginning of finding an answer is the coming together, putting our heads together, and trying to find a route out of this nightmare that we all find ourselves in. But as one of my friends always says, the world was made by people making decisions, and the world can be remade by people making decisions. And it's up to us to make sure that we play our part in creating a new, just, equitable social order where everyone has a chance for a life of nobility, of dignity, and sufficiency. Thank you so much to everyone. Next week we have a new. We take a closer look at the climate question, and we figure out how can we save our planet amidst all these fractures. Please make sure to tell your friends. Please register. Join us next week. We'll have a very strong panel, and we're going to really go deep into this. It's going to be informative and useful. Don't forget to share. And this session has been recorded and will be shared with the digest of all the different contributions that have been made. If you find this session useful, if you find this work useful, it takes a lot of time and effort and money to put this together. So please do support the organizing organizations, the Transnational Institute, Alternative Information and Development Center, the Asia Europe People's Forum, the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, and Help your local progressive. Go out to a direct action. Let's remember the people of Palestine. Let's remember the people of Congo. Let's remember the people of Sudan. And let's always remember why we do what we do. Thank you so much to everyone, and see you next time.